Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. Our mission is to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. I'm Zoe Emma.
And I'm Paul Thomas. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption. But over the last few years, our guests have shown us something more important and urgent: how traditional ways of leading have changed forever. Our mission is to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, covering topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and resilience, and from climate change to AI. If it's about the state of leadership in 2026, it will be on our podcast.
We're not here for the shiny corporate case studies. We share stories from leaders who have learned lessons and made progress the hard way, navigating complexity and providing inspiration across every sector.
And in today's episode, we're speaking with Kat Thomas, entrepreneur and author of Weapons of Mass Confidence, an exploration of how AI can help close the confidence gap for women in the workplace and beyond. It's a really interesting conversation, and one that, as a man, I wanted to give you and Kat more room to explore together. But Zoe, as a woman and a woman who advises organizations on AI and technology strategy, how does confidence show up in the conversations you're having with leaders every day?
I mean, it's interesting because I do think that a lot of the tech leaders that I'm working with more closely on AI do tend to be men. And as you know, I'd like to see more diversity in this space for sure. And the conversation that we had with Kat, and indeed her fantastic book, which I'd really recommend to all of our listeners, really made me think about how a lot of the use cases get talked about are those hero use cases. So AI helped company X make this amount of money or save this amount of time, which equated to this amount of money. And it's all success defined within a very, very narrow, and you could argue quite patriarchal template. Whereas the stuff that Kat talks about in her book is just as valuable, right? So she opens the book by talking about how she was going through a really difficult time trying to help her dad move into, I think, a supported accommodation, and how there was a lot of admin to do around some very stressful life events at work there that she had to guide him through and negotiate with a lot of authorities and the local council and everything on. And that is also really valuable work, right? Because it's really about the value of the emotional labor and the work that is often done by women behind the scenes and unrecognized. So if AI can help lift the burden on that and make things easier for people, then that's surely a very good thing.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think in adoption stories like this, you need that this massive change happened because of this technology, but you also need to see some of the more real and human stories. And often those are the stories that we hear from organizations that are about small change. And I think giving the confidence to everyone to embrace AI in a way that they've not necessarily been offered before, I think is really helpful. I mean, I shared some anecdote, very, very anecdotal evidence in the recording that it's women in the workplaces that I support who tend to be more cautious about working with AI. Is that something you also recognize?
Sometimes. I mean, I think it's quite varied. And actually, I've noticed that more of the women that I know personally and professionally are starting to use AI. As we said, though, there is a bit of a prevailing trend. Certainly, I still think there are more men I speak to or work with or know who are using AI rather than women, for example. But yes, it's really interesting how there is a bit of a split there. And I still don't really know why that is. I suspect it's partly to do with how AI gets talked about in the media, who is leading on a lot of this stuff. We know that a lot of the leaders of the biggest tech companies are men, for example. So that's the thing, isn't it? You can't really be the change if you don't see the change. It's that old tenet of EDI, isn't it?
That was quite a similar story at the beginning of the social media boom. A lot of men talking to each other on social media. I know, particularly in this household, my wife took a bit longer to come to X and Twitter, was very much present on Facebook. But once the sort of the conversational social media started up and you were having conversations with strangers online, that felt like a male-dominated space to begin with.
I think there's a few podcasts that really should be renamed Men Talking to Each Other, isn't there? This seems to be a
Yeah.
recurring theme which happens in any online and indeed offline space. So I'm pleased you're
Yeah.
recognising that finally, Paul.
Clapping each other on the back. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So aside from reading Kat's book and listening to this episode of Starts at the Top, what advice would you give women listening to this who may be more trepidatious about AI and how it affects them at work and home?
I'd give women and indeed anyone who might be getting used to AI or hasn't used it before, just start with something really, really simple. There's loads of really good advice about this in Kat's book, but even something really small like drafting an email, doing a bit of research, coming up with some ideas, just keeping it really, really simple to start with. Obviously, don't put any sensitive data into free tools, and Kat makes that point really well in her book too, but just make it really easy. And these models are often so good now. Obviously, they're not foolproof. You really need to verify your outputs. You really need to make sure it's not hallucinating, but you don't need to be especially technical in terms of how you prompt. Just ask it a question, just start talking to it.
Yeah, it's interesting that somebody was asking me about writing prompts the other day, and I said sometimes I can be quite prescriptive about it and quite sort of making sure that the building blocks are in there. But quite often it is just a very open question. This is how I'm feeling about a particular subject. Can you look at these two documents and tell me what you see? And I think some of that sort of more open questioning is quite interesting. And talking as we were a minute ago about the men dominating the conversation around AI, you wanted to talk about that that conversation we started last week with Rishi Sunak, who's been talking about AI and taxation.
Yes, absolutely. So, two cases in point,
Yeah.
decisions being made by men, men leading conversations about AI. So, we're perpetuating this stuff now. But there's two really interesting stories here, which I thought would be good for us to get into. So, this Rishi Sunak story that I think we touched on the other week, I thought this was actually really interesting. So, this was a BBC article, and we'll link to it in the show notes. Former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, he of former Number 10 fame, he's obviously now an advisor to AI firm Anthropic and Microsoft as well. But a really interesting article actually about how there are already less jobs for young people because of AI, which is something we've talked about a lot on the podcast and we'll be talking about much more with a very exciting guest in the future. But also just some really interesting things that Sunak is here from talking to companies about AI. This prevailing trend of there being less jobs for young people because of AI, there's also something here about a bigger trend to do with recruitment overall. And he talks about this phrase that he's hearing from a lot of CEOs that flat is the new up. And actually, I think this has been around for a while, but it hasn't been talked about very much, which is this idea that you can continue to grow your business without having to significantly increase headcount because people are starting to see greater efficiencies and a lot more value and capabilities unlocked from AI. And this is the sort of thing which starts to break your brain, isn't it, when it comes to AI?
Mm.
Because we all think the stereotypical model of an organization that's growing, whatever sector it's in, is one where you're bringing in more revenue. In the corporate world, as you term it, you would call it you more profitable. And you're taking on more people. But if you can actually bring in more income and have the same amount of people, or perhaps in some cases even less people, then that in itself is a really different model for of what growth looks like, isn't it?
Yeah, it completely changed, and I think even in the conversations, in early conversations I have with firms, there is this sort of elephant in the room that says, "Oh, we're going to end up talking about headcount reduction and all that." That sort of stuff does come up quite soon in the
Mm.
conversation, but as they start to dig into what these tools actually mean, I really do think it becomes a conversation about how we do more with what we have. And then, yeah, of course, there has to be recognition that later down the line that might include job changes. And I think it's as important to have a direction or a target that looks at how the role of everyone in an organization changes because of this technology and because of these tools. It's kind of going back to the digital transformation conversation that sort of bubbled around in the background, but is now really, really present for everyone. Is just really looking at how that is going to affect the employees that you have and whether that's getting them to do more with the tools that are available, or ultimately looking at how their roles are going to change and how different roles are going to be needed, and therefore roles that have existed for a long time might disappear.
Well, this is it, isn't it? And there's part of me that's simultaneously really nervous, but also excited about the
Mm.
impact on the job market in the sense that there are a number of people out there. So, for example, I was listening to Matt Clifford on Amal Rajan's podcast Radical the other week. We was talking about how there are going to be a lot more jobs created, for example. So I don't think it's necessarily all going to be doom and gloom, but there are going to be changes to the workforce. I do think that is really inevitable. Why I keep coming back to this article, though, is that I think it does really flip the power dynamic in favour of employers rather than employees. And I was thinking about what the impact of this is if you're kind of a young, ambitious person under 40 and you're starting to make your way in the workforce. If there are more organisations that eventually default to this kind of flatter structure where perhaps organisations are staying the same in terms of headcount or even perhaps contracting a little, I do think every organisation or structure needs a degree of elasticity, right? So whether it's being able to take on some new people or whether it's the way you collaborate with other organisations. As a younger person, as you go into the workforce and you progress, you want to see a path, right? You want to see places you can go. And if there are less opportunities to do that, I do think we'll miss out on some really significant talent, actually. So that is what I'd advise any leader listening who's toying with those kind of decisions to think about. Yes, you want greater efficiency and profitability and all that, nothing wrong with that. But do think about the kind of carrots that you can give to talented young people coming up through the ranks about where they could eventually be.
Yeah, especially true in partner-led organizations where that's always been the end destination. You know,
Mm.
that's the firms I work with where you're looking at people coming into into the firm as trainees who have no ambition at all to be partners. What they want is a job and a means to an end that helps them to explore a whole bunch of other things that they're interested in. Yeah, I think you're right. That elasticity. I was going to say it's like surfing a wave, isn't it? You've got to be constantly aware and agile and looking at what might be ahead and how you might have to shift direction very very quickly. That's a good analogy. But I think it's really
Nice.
important to do that and within organisations to embrace that and to help your employees embrace it as well. Because I
Mm.
think, as you said, that traditional path from A to B, from manager to senior manager to director to CEO might not be for everyone and it might not be available anymore either. So it's really interesting to watch.
Exactly. And I do think the better employers will still be creating a variety of different paths for their employees in order to get the most of the talent that's out there.
Yeah. Just a small example, I think IT teams that I'm working with, for example, looking at people that in their teams that have an interest at the moment in AI, which is taking them away from the job that they were employed to do. So it might be that you've got somebody that's been ticking tickets off of a help desk, and now they're starting to get interested in automation and AI, and how you might have to
Mm.
shift them away from what they were doing to give them the time and space to experiment and play with those things that are going to become increasingly important. And then finally, the other story that you've highlighted on your blog as well, and it's only just occurred to me that Claude is called Claude, and that's a male name. I'm sure there's some kind of interpretation in there, or it means something else, but Claude is traditionally a man's name, and that's just struck me. But you've highlighted changes in Claude's pricing model and how that affects our AI dependency.
Yeah, so I'll put the link to my blog in the show notes, but essentially it was prompted by a change that we saw. It was tested by Claude about its pricing model. So it was just rolled out to a small number of new sites. Essentially what they did was they tested removing Claude code from its pro plan, meaning
Mm.
that you would have to upgrade to a much more expensive plan. And there was a huge backlash against that. And it does seem to be part of a bigger trend that I'm hearing about on podcasts such as the Artificial Intelligence Show, which is a really brilliant podcast about AI trends, where they have talked about AI tools moving away from the traditional software as a service model, which is all built around buying licenses for individual users, to plans that are much more about metered usage or ones where there's a bit more of a hybrid element to them as well. So some of it's obviously based on tokens and that kind of thing. So I think this takes us into some really tricky territory actually for small business, but also for charities as well, where you are potentially, depending on the whims and decisions made by some of these companies, building in a bit more flexibility around your budgeting in terms of variable costs for tech. But that is a challenge if there isn't that much money in the first place. And you also need to think about business continuity as well, because we're all becoming increasingly much more dependent on AI. And obviously, I'm a big advocate for AI, but you do need a business continuity plan if your tool that you really rely on, say to deliver services, falls over or suddenly they put in some massive pricing hike and it becomes really difficult to deliver what you need to. So I think there's a lot of moving parts here that we'll all need to start to plan in around the way that we budget, the way that we run our operations, the way we manage risk. And there's a lot of leaders listening, whether you work in charity grant making or whether you work as a partner in an accounting firm, where this is a bit of a new reality we'll all have to get our heads around.
Yeah, I think it's the age old challenge, isn't it? I'm just thinking of two examples, like Spotify, for example, where everyone was on the free version and had to move on to a premium version. I'm thinking about how we look at our Sky, our broadband bill, and say, how on earth has that got to that point? But it's the change over time and our reliance on those delivery methods. I mean, how we would do anything in the world without those broadband connections, for example, is really hard to see. We need it, and therefore the reliance on it becomes even greater. And therefore, when it's taken away, we don't quite know what to do with ourselves. Last year, when my broadband was out, I think we had to stop the podcast for a couple of weeks because it was just gone, and I had
Oh,
no way
yeah.
of being able to record. So I
Mm.
think those sorts of things we do need to get used to, and I think we probably do need to have those redundancy ideas. I think also it's a good opportunity for businesses. I'm working with a business at the moment, and one of the first things we did was start to review their tech stack from top
Mm.
to bottom and look at where the prioritization should be. I think the partners around the table were looking at a list of over 120 different applications, and they're saying, well, we can't see the wood from the trees. Doing a sort of a simple RAG rating on the software and the tools, the applications that you have under the roof, so that you know that top tier of red rated applications are the ones you really need to pay attention to and have those redundancy
Mm.
plans in place. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it feels a little bit like the turning of the screw, but I think that's the way this model is going to shift over the next 18 months or so.
Yeah, I think you could be right. Definitely more developments ahead.
So now for our conversation with Kat Thomas, author of Weapons of Mass Confidence. Kat Thomas is the author of Weapons of Mass Confidence, a timely and provocative exploration of how AI can help close the confidence gap for women at work and beyond. Built around her Just Ask philosophy, the book reframes AI as a practical, everyday tool for turning hesitation into action, helping people navigate everything from career decisions to personal health conversations with greater clarity and conviction. Kat is an in demand voice on confidence, visibility, and the role of AI in shaping modern behavior. She is a creative entrepreneur and founder of Knock Three Times, a new and first creative communications company built for the AI era. Previously, she founded the multi-award winning PR agency One Green Bean in Sydney in 2007, expanding it to London in 2015. Over the course of her career, Kat has led campaigns for brands including Virgin Atlantic, Nike, Google, IKEA, Ben& and Jerry's, and Uber, building a global reputation for culturally impactful, earned-led work. Her campaigns have been recognised with more than 100 international awards, including multiple honours at Cannes Lions International Festival of Creativity, where she served as president of the PR jury in 2024. Known for a distinctive blend of irreverence, playfulness, and cultural instinct, Kat's work consistently puts audience attention first. Alongside her commercial work, Kat is an active contributor to the creative industries, regularly serving on global award juries and supporting initiatives that champion the next generation of talent. Her perspective sits at the intersection of creativity, culture, and technology, perfect for this podcast, with a particular focus on how new tools are reshaping confidence, influence, and opportunity for womankind. Welcome to the podcast, Kat.
Thank you. That was quite the intro.
It's a long one, but it's a
Yeah,
good
it
one.
is. Thank you for going through it. No, thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. It's lovely to be chatting.
AI is a big topic on this podcast, and we hear a lot about how AI is leading to good things and also to some nightmare scenarios. Your book talks about where AI can be a force for good. And I think it really focuses on that right from the start. So, can you tell us about your experience of this, especially with some of the stories around supporting your dad in moving into a care home?
Yeah, so if we rewind 18 months, I was working in a big global network in a comms environment. I'd sold my business to a global network and had sort of transitioned into being part of the leadership team. And so there was a very dominant AI conversation 18 months ago. We all know that it was coming in various sort of waves in a kind of communications and professional sense. And as many people were, I was doing that juggle of a big job, a lot of stress, a lot of pressure. And then in my personal life, I was dealing with elderly parents. I'm an only child and they're divorced. And my dad doesn't live in the UK. Well, he lives in Jersey in the Channel Islands, which is a very different environment to mainland England or the UK. And I found myself having conversations around AI and efficiencies and the big change that was coming in a professional context. And then out of work, I was just sort of juggling and navigating my dad's health failing. It became apparent he couldn't live solo anymore. And I was just trying to navigate my way through the care system in a country where he lives and I don't, which Jersey doesn't have the NHS. It has very different systems. It has a lot more bureaucracy, which I'll probably come on to. So it was a really complicated process and made harder by the fact that I don't live there and it's a flight away. It was really out of a fit of desperation that I downloaded ChatGPT after I had been Googling and researching and trying to have calls. And there's elements, Jersey's a wonderful place, but there is elements of it that probably have an energy of still being in the 80s or the 70s, because I would have a phone call with someone and they would say, well, you have to come in to the drop in between 3 and 5 on a Thursday. And I'm like, I don't live in Jersey, so is there any other way around that? No, you must come into the drop-in centre 3 to 5 on a Thursday. There was one situation where I flew over for the drop-in centre 3 to 5 on a Thursday and the person was sick and there was a little sign on the counter. So it was all of that. So downloading ChatGPT actually didn't come from a professional place. It came from a personal requirement of having to research, understand, navigate the care system in Jersey, which is very different to the UK. Also, my dad was sort of frail in a mobility sense. He uses the phrase, I haven't lost my marbles, so I'm allowed to use it. So it was also quite delicate because I knew he needed help, but it wasn't a case of I needed to step in a sort of power of attorney sort of scenario. He had to be on that journey. So it was stressful, complicated, hard to navigate, time consuming, and just a lot to try and fit around life and a full-time job. So that's where my first sort of experience came. And it was life-changing, really, because I could just ask the questions and research it in a way that sort of made sense to me in terms of the steps I needed to follow. And I just sort of blew my mind, really, because the information that I had struggled for months to find was there at my fingertips. And not only there at my fingertips, it was calibrated and put together in a way that was just very easy to follow, and I could clearly see the steps that were required. So I think it's interesting that I was part of these big board meetings having conversations around AI and how it's going to revolutionize everything, but actually the initial impact was very much in my personal life, not my professional life. So when we finally transitioned him into care, and as your viewers and listeners will know, you're quite often obligated to make a contribution to the cost. So as soon as he transitioned into care, the bills started coming, the pressure started coming. So the plan was that I had to find a way to rent out or sell his flat so that we could cover the cost of his care. And I just hit the most extraordinary barrier where, because his flat wasn't connected to the mainland fibre optic broadband, you are not allowed to rent or sell a property that hasn't been connected. So I thought, well, that's okay. I will just get it connected. How hard can that be? But therein followed about 7 months of me going round and round and round in circles with Jersey Electricity and Jersey Telecom, who kept telling me that I was not allowed to connect this property to the infrastructure because I'm not a Jersey resident. So we're getting really complex here because I was born in Jersey, but I left before my 10 years, which qualify me as a resident when my parents split up. So long story short, this just went on for months. I had to engage a lawyer. The lawyer was like, it reached sort of dead ends. So it cost me several thousand to try and resolve. As the bills were mounting up, I had letting agents, estate agents saying, we cannot sell this property. We cannot let this property until it's connected to the fibre optic broadband. And I've got the fibre optic broadband company saying, you don't have permission to connect it. And it was just tear inducing, really. And that was the game changer. I put this very complex situation into ChatGPT and it said, yes, this is complex, but it's very easily solvable. Here are the 5 steps, the order you need to do it in. Here are the emails you need to send. And this is the process you need to follow. And it was resolved in about 10 days. And this whole thing kicked off in January and it was finally resolved September, October time. So I had months and months of trying to figure it out by myself. And that really was kind of the impetus for writing the book because I just thought, well, I'd probably still be, 2 years on, I'd probably still be trying to resolve that. So that's where I just went, oh, hang on, I do not want to be a rejecter of technology that can make my life easier, that can solve things that I'm finding it almost impossible to tackle. So that was really the impetus for the book because it just was the ultimate sort of light bulb moment.
And that's such an amazing example because what your book made me think about a lot is so often we hear about these big flagship use cases of company X used agentic AI to help them do this thing or to make this amount of profit or save this amount of time. And of course, that matters. At the same time, there are stories like your dad's and your story, which are life changing, right? They're really, really important. And yet those case studies don't get nearly enough airtime. And I'm so grateful to you for putting those use cases on the map in this book because they're vitally important, right? They're vitally important to the health of society, to care, to the work which all of us are doing behind the scenes to look after our nearest and dearest.
Yeah, I mean, for me, life is increasingly a struggle and a juggle. And I think you enter different eras. And I think women, particularly, no offense, Paul, but I think women particularly enter an era where they're carrying a lot. They might have young kids or teenage kids, elderly parents, holding down a full time job, making a lot of decisions in the household, running the household. It's a lot. And I think that the bandwidth squeeze for women particularly is greater than ever. I certainly feel it. And there is a big debate around, whether we should be using AI and is it a shortcut and is it softening all our brain cells? But the position I take is if it's going to make your life a bit easier, if it's going to reduce your stress levels, if it's going to push you forward when you might have held back, then using AI in a meaningful way when it matters, I think I'm absolutely for it because life is hard enough.
Absolutely. And building on that, a fantastic phrase in the book, which I hadn't heard before, but I really liked and going to be deploying everywhere, is about the confidence gap and how AI can help women close that. Can you tell our listeners a bit more about what the confidence gap is and how AI can close that gap?
So I've been an employer for approaching 20 years. I started my first business in my late 20s and have been in that kind of self-employed building businesses sort of mode for a couple of decades. And I think one of the takeaways from that is the difference between confidence and capability, I could probably say. And I think that if I was to make a broad statement, I think women hold back. I think confidence holds women back a lot more than men. And I think that that's a shame because I think women sometimes, have an awful lot of competence and are brilliant for the job, but it's not ability, it's confidence that holds them back. So I think that there's this very tangible confidence gap. And I think that women experience it much more than men. And for me, the thing that I get, very sort of optimistic about is if we close that confidence gap, if women feel more empowered, feel more confident, have more time to ask for the pay rise, negotiate their position at work, negotiate and enhance severance if it's time to sort of exit a business. If women have that sort of confidence a lot more and at scale, that could significantly change the landscape in a sort of professional context. So for me, the confidence gap is very much around, I suppose, that space between where men might go for it, but women might hold back. There's been a lot of research how a man will scan a job description and know that they can do 60 to 70% of it. So they're like, I will definitely apply for that role. Whereas a woman would scan a job description, see that they could do 60 or 70% of it and fixate on the 40% that they haven't got the experience in and probably not apply. And that's where I would like women to just push themselves forward a little bit more. Are you familiar with that sort of scenario?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, even at this stage in my career and personally as well, I've got 2 teenagers, I run a business, and all of those different things that you're holding and juggling. But even at this point, with where I am professionally, I do constantly second guess myself and say, can I do that? So I loved your point in the book about AI creating a kind of rehearsal space and almost a coach for
Yeah.
women to talk through some of those difficult scenarios and plan for them. And you set out some of those planning for difficult conversations or planning for tricky situations in such detail and depth in the book, which I think is wonderful. Can you give us a bit more of a flavour of the variety of different ways in which AI can help with those
Yeah.
challenging moments?
Well, I think, and again, I can only speak as a woman, and maybe men do this too. But when you're anxious about having to have a conversation, you do go over it and over it and over it, and you mentally rehearse it and you mentally rehearse it. And then you get into the room and freeze, even though that you've sort of mentally been rehearsing it for days or hours. So for me, just being able to construct, just help you put your argument together or put your case together, or even rehearse what some of the pushbacks might be or some of the questions might be. I think that's one of the many game changers of these tools, is that you can use them as a safe space, as a rehearsal room, to just sort of get a little bit more confidence and get a little bit more savvy in the language you want to use and the framing that you're using and the points that you want to make. And I think that we have difficult conversations in so many areas of life. At work is an obvious one, or difficult or challenging or nerve-inducing conversations. But more widely than that, when you're having a conversation, when you know you've got a doctor's appointment and you've got 9 minutes and you really want to talk succinctly about your symptoms and you want to ask for a specific test or two, just being able to figure out how to get into that room and optimize and make the most of that small window you've got, and land the points you want to land brilliantly. Then a rehearsal space, a private opportunity to just figure out how you want to say something, how you want to frame something, the points you want to make in a succinct, articulate way is invaluable. And I don't think we've had that until tools like Claude and ChatGPT and so forth.
And it's really interesting, isn't it? Because what your book made me think about is that that is a kind of invisible space, isn't it? In many ways, a sort of hidden one. Because again, I'm probably going to stereotype and generalize here. And Paul, please feel free to jump in and
I
challenge
will. I
me.
will jump
You're
in and
being very,
defend
very
all men.
quiet, Paul. Sorry.
I will
Um,
jump in and defend all men when I need
Yes,
to. I mean, obviously,
you're
we
here.
need defending.
You're here to be the voice of mankind today, Paul.
I mean,
Yes.
you've got things like the the cliche, the old boys network and that sort of thing, and spaces which are there by men to help men. And obviously, there are many spaces we all have. I'm thinking of all my WhatsApp groups with my wonderful female friends, which are spaces to help women. But everyone is so busy, aren't they? And just having this moment where you can work with a tool which has got infinite time and infinite skills and capabilities to give you to walk you through difficult situations like the one with your dad and getting him access to care and sorting out his home and his assets. That's a wonderful thing, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a big sort of debate around whether people should be using these tools, and there's obviously a huge conversation around their environmental impact and the ethical sort of conversation. And as you'll have seen in the book, I don't sort of steer away from any of that. I think that that scrutiny is required. But for me, it's about using it in a meaningful way, and at moments it matters, and not being frivolous, but being smart and having your eyes open in the way you use these tools. Because I'm sure you know that there's a fine line between, as I'm sure from your experience with them, they're very enthusiastic and very encouraging. So you can pop anything in, and it's, oh, this is a great idea. Let's build on this. In fact, the scenarios that I talk about in the book are very diverse because I spoke to a lot of people, a lot of women who had just started to find that they were pushing themselves forward a little bit more because they'd been using AI tools. And that's, should I start a business? A lot of women go, I don't know the first thing about that. What on earth? Where would I start? But suddenly you've got this step by step conversation that's unfolding that as you're gathering information, it's building your confidence. I talked to someone else who was talking about trying to figure out whether they should, the age old debate, should I move? Should we extend into the loft? Do I calibrate the ceiling of the value of the properties on my street? And this is all really overwhelming. But suddenly you can, in a methodical way, start pulling all that information together, pulling all that data together, and again, just building your confidence that you feel more knowledgeable and you feel more empowered to make the right decision for you. So I think using these tools to gather information, to calibrate how you feel about something that you're considering, be that starting a business, be that buying an electric car, be that renovating your home or moving, be that wanting to have a surgery, a knee replacement, whatever it is, just being able to seek all that information out, reassure you that you feel a lot more knowledgeable, and then building your confidence in the process. We've not had that before, but we do now. So I think that's where I get excited at the potential of women using these tools at scale to push themselves forward where they previously might have held back. And for me, there's two factors here. And I think, as I touched on earlier, there is a confidence factor. I don't know if it's controversial or not, but I do think some women, um, have challenges around confidence. Not all women, but some. But I also think more broadly, women have challenges around bandwidth, time, pressure, prioritizing. I often talk to my friends about the list. You know that list? It's either mental or it's written in your phone, and it just gets longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. And you're just constantly trying to tackle the list. And the list is life admin, things to do, family commitments, things to buy, things to sell, and it's just never ending. And I think the mental bandwidth in the modern life that we all live is so pressurized that that's where I think AI tools come into their own, especially for women, I think.
I think you're right. And as I work predominantly with professional services firms, accountancy firms, at the firms that I work with, one of the things I always check is what's the gender balance. And roughly speaking, they are in that 50-50. There's that magic 48-52 that we
Yeah.
all love so much. That there's, roughly speaking, it's in that bracket. But anecdotally, the pushback when I talk about AI training, for example, does come from female voices. And I do hear that sort of sense. It's very anecdotal. I haven't got any evidence to support this, but I can't think of a single man in a conversation that hasn't said, oh, yeah, I'd love to come along to that training. Whereas the women within those firms, the ones that I talk to in advance of that training arriving, are a little bit more cautious and a little bit more out of step. And what you're making me feel and think is, how can we preload them with some of this information that helps them to find the use cases that you're exploring. So when they walk in the room in a professional context, they've got a much clearer setting for, yeah, actually, I can use these tools because I am using them in my day to day life. And it's not just about how I perform or how I stand out, how I exist within this corporate framework that I work within.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. For International Women's Day recently, I commissioned a study, a sort of nationally representative study, because I wanted to look at AI use in a sort of professional context. And the study revealed something that was really quite interesting, which was this sort of notion of who's using AI for power moves and who's using AI for polish. And it revealed that men at the moment are more likely to be using AI to triangulate their earning potential, to benchmark their salary and look at where they could push it. And women were more leaning into make this email sound better, make this document
Mm.
sound more professional, polish the written sort of quality of this proposal. So that was particularly interesting that it highlighted that men and women are embracing these tools, but there's a pocket of difference there because men are sort of using them perhaps a bit more to push ahead. And one of the other stats that came out of that study, which was really interesting to me, was a much higher proportion of women to men felt like using AI is cheating and had a slight guilt factor about it and didn't even register with men. It was so different and so much higher for women. And that is reflected, with conversations that I have. As you mentioned, I'm building my third business at the moment, and AI and AI capability is sort of sitting at the heart of it. And the first people that have come on board on the team, that in the initial sort of few weeks were sort of like, should I use AI for this? Should I use AI for that? I'm like, yes, have a look, see, play with it, experiment. Yes. But there's a strange guilt factor, I think, that skews much more towards women than men about even using AI. So I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I agree, and I also wonder whether it's sometimes aligned to the work that you do in the industry that you're in. So, for example, working with accountants using AI is almost being pictured in the press and in everything you read as a shortcut. We're going to reduce um, we're going to reduce those sort of day-to-day activities and roles by using AI. So I think people already see it as a shortcut, and I think it's much better to look at it in the way that you're framing it, which is it's a resource to equip you to go and have the conversation that you need to have much better. And again, that's something that confidence confidence within these types of firms it's not just a female thing. It's often an access thing because they're partner led and they're driven by
Yeah.
these sort of powerful rainmakers. There's a middle layer that doesn't get to have the conversations with clients, doesn't get to practice, and could use these tools in order to elevate themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you write a book, you sort of get to that point where you've got a draft manuscript and you've spent so long with it, you're like, is this any good? Like what? You're sort of so deep in it that I really wanted to do a first pass sort of edit, and I wanted to do it with a journalist, and I wanted to do it with a journalist from a broadsheet, um, newspaper, someone who writes for the Times or the Telegraph, or just someone that could give me a very sort of authoritative, very direct kind of feedback and first pass on the edit. But what was particularly important to me was it needed to be someone that had used AI. And so I cherry picked about five, and I wanted it to be a woman. So I cherry picked five tier one freelance journalists for national broadsheet and news outlets who do sort of editing. And I had a call with all of them to explain the premise of the book and what I wanted, them to do, which was to do a first pass on a very raw sort of manuscript and give it to me, warts and all, with the feedback. And all of them were very sort of engaged with that until I got to the point in the call where I said, so have you downloaded ChatGPT or are you using Claude? And the response from all of them was visceral in their rejection. Because I think in the media world and the journalism world, the sentiment was AI is coming for our jobs. Our jobs are not going to exist in 5 years thanks to AI. And the reaction was pure rejection. So for me, I just thought that was absolutely fascinating because it just showed that there was just this sort of holding back, fingers in the ears, don't want to know about it. And it struck me that I was trying to find a journalist in a high powered news sort of environment who was using ChatGPT. And I'm sure many, many, many more are now. But 9 months ago, the sentiment that I was getting was one of real rejection because of the fear of it coming for the jobs. which I thought was really, really interesting.
So did you find one?
I did, yes, who came on the journey and was resistant to sort of the notion of AI. But I think it was quite a healthy sort of conversation because we were able to sort of wrestle and discuss the sort of pros and cons, and we both understand each other's worlds. So I did. But for me, it was just fascinating that the narrative, certainly 9 months ago, was it's coming for our jobs. And look, I think that there is a reality attached to that. We've seen an enormous shift, certainly in the communications and the media industry, the sort of shrinking and the contracting of businesses, and AI is playing a big part of that. So it is a dynamic landscape, as people say, and it is a reality. And I think that my view my view on that, I was having a conversation with someone recently who sort of said to me, I don't think my job is going to exist in 10 years time. And I said, well, you need to start using AI to figure out where you're going to pivot, what you want to do, what it is going to look like, and be front footed with it versus sort of wait for that inevitable sort of change to come. So we are in an era of change. AI is driving that. Some of it is very frustrating. Some of it will be profound in its impact, but we have to move. We have to move with it, don't we? So I think it's having your eyes open and trying to be on the front foot with navigating it and pivoting and changing lanes and finding new careers direction because it's necessary.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's even more important for women in some ways, isn't it? Because I read so many studies where it talks about how the impact of AI on the workforce is going to disproportionately affect women and also people from marginalised communities. And on that note, I wanted to come back to the excellent point you were making earlier about the ethical considerations and, of course, the environmental considerations around AI, as well as it being a exciting and liberatory force for all the reasons we've talked about. Can we talk about that dark side then of AI? So, what do women need to be aware of there?
I mean, I've had a lot of conversations on this, and particularly I enjoy getting into the sort of real detractors and the people that are really sort of rejectors. I think there's the overarching piece that I come back to is that AI is trained on everything that exists in the world. And if women pull back, if women reject it, then we're going to make the biases 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times worse. So, we have to lean into it with our eyes open. These models are trained on being used. And if women reject that, they're going to be even more trained on data and sentiment and behavior of men. So women have to show up and be part of it. And because the alternative doesn't bear thinking about. So yes, I think women will be affected sort of disproportionately from a jobs landscape. You'll have probably seen there's a lot of research around junior to mid-level white collar jobs that are being automated, and women are feeling the impact of that more than men. I think you'll have seen in many cases of the much darker side of sort of deep fakes and the bias that is coming out of these things. I think regulation is going to be key, but that's going to be needing to be meaningful, and governments and systems are needing to stay a step ahead, two steps ahead of these big tech companies, and these big tech companies that are becoming increasingly powerful. So regulation is key. It needs to be meaningful regulation. But I think for women at an individual level, I got into the very big conversation with someone online earlier this week who just sort of said it will never be a feminist tool, women shouldn't use it. And I sort of went, well, if we all took that attitude, it certainly would never be. So we have to show up and participate, because at the moment it reflects all the biases of the world back at you because it's trained on all the data that exists. So unless we play an active part in that, it will get worse, not better. So I take the view that women need to show up and be heard and participate and engage with it, because the alternative yeah, as I said, doesn't bear thinking about really.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that if you're not part of the conversation and the development, then you're actually making a very significant decision there, aren't you?
Well, one of the data points that I found was so interesting when I was researching the book was around the arrival of online banking, which when it first arrived was incredibly male dominated because women held back because of an anxiousness of fraud or a lack of confidence in using this online technology to do your banking. And then women sort of the confidence levels leveled out, and then actually it exceeded. And social media was similar. When social media first launched, it was more male dominated than women, and then it sort of leveled up and then actually was exceeded by women. So there is a narrative that this is a trend we're seeing again. At the moment, you've got the arrival of AI and it's slightly more being embraced. But for me, I think the stakes are much higher. I think if women hold back, that leveling up will take longer. And as I sort of explain in the book, I think, and I'm so sorry, Paul, but men do have an advantage in this life. And if they're using AI to push themselves further and women aren't, then that advantage gets even bigger, and that gap gets even wider. So I feel quite single-minded that women can't get left behind because there's an ethical hill that they've chosen to die on. It's not going to win.
This isn't a question; it's more of a statement, sort of from the man in the conversation. But I think the way that I see it is these tools are being built by many men. They're being adopted in a world that's already isn't neutral. So men like me can either jump on a podcast, host a podcast, and or we can quietly benefit from that in the background, or we can help to rebalance it. And I think that's what I'm learning from you and from this conversation is that my role in the work that I do is to go out and rebalance that, to draw attention to it, to highlight it, to put your book in the hands of the women that I come across who do have that air of caution about it and make sure they're involved in every conversation. That's about as much as I can do, I think.
Yeah, I've had some lovely messages where people have said, "Oh, I've bought your book. I've bought it for my 12-year-old daughter," and I've written back and said, "You need to buy it for your mother, not your 12-year-old daughter," because I think 12-year-olds are born into a world which is AI literate. They're going to be native very quickly, whereas I think anyone sort of 40 plus is probably in a bracket of have a slight more tendency to reject it or think I haven't got time for another app. I haven't got time for more technology in my life. So I've sort of said to people, please give the book to women you know that are skeptics, women you know that think they haven't got time, women you know that think it's not for me. That's the space where I think it could add the most value. And I'm all about unlocking skepticism and reaching out to cynics and persuading them to give it a go and seeing where they get to with it.
As regular listeners will know, my mum listens to this podcast. So happy birthday, mum. You know what you're getting now.
Yes. I'll send your mum a copy, Paul. We're probably
Thanks.
family in some capacity. I see we're both
Well,
Thomas. So
and
I'll
her name is Kay Thomas. So it's very, very close. Every time I see an email come in, it's very, very close. And she has had that conversation very recently about her broadband and she rejected it. So I think we might be peas in a pod.
yeah, I mean, that's the other thing, negotiating your utilities. We all hate doing it, but I would be over a year ago now, decided to do that for my sort of broadband provider. And I basically asked one of these AI tools to just write me a script to have the conversation. And it told me step by step what to say. It told me, then they're going to say this, then they're going to pass you to another department, then you need to hold firm on this point. And I eventually saved about 40 quid a month. So, it was arduous to spend 25 minutes on the phone. But in the climate we're in, being able to find yourself a meaningful saving in one of your sort of utility bills is, fantastic win, another fantastic win. So yes, I'll send your mum a copy of the book and she can start negotiating all her utilities with a newfound sense of confidence.
Sounds good.
Amazing. She'll be a woman transformed. So, Kat, finally, what is the one thing you would like everyone to remember about your book?
I suppose the premise that I talk to in the book is this sort of notion of just ask. I think at the end of the day, women hold back from asking the question, asking for feedback, asking for a salary review at work, asking, is there a promotion opportunity in the next 12 months? Just ask the question. And I think now we have these tools where you can ask that question in private, you can rehearse that conversation, you can source all the information, you can build your confidence by asking the right questions to gather all the information you need. So ask questions, just ask questions. Ask questions first in an AI tool like a Claude, like a ChatGPT, like a Gemini. Build all your information, get yourself feeling really comfortable and really confident, and then just ask. Because what's the worst that can happen? Ask your utility for a saving. Ask your boss for a pay rise. Ask your neighbor to cut that tree that needs cutting down because it's blocking all your light. Just figure out how to ask the questions that will get you either small wins, big wins, push you forward, and take you from sort of feeling anxious to feeling a little bit more confident and like you can go for it. Asking questions has never been easier, and I think the more that women ask, the more that women get.
That's fantastic, Kat. Brilliant. We have loved your book, and I think it's such an important part of the debate and discussion and development of AI to have conversations like this. And we love your journey as a leader as well. And I can see how all of that experience has very much been brought to bear in this fantastic book,
Oh,
which we very much recommend everyone read. So thank you so much for coming on Starts at the Top. We've loved talking to you.
thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Paul. It's been so lovely to chat to you, and thank you for your support for the book. And it's interesting to know you both work in sort of dimensions of AI in two very different areas, from charity to accountancy. But I think that's the point. It's touching everyone's lives. It's touching everyone's sort of careers in a sort of professional context. So
Yeah.
we need to be knowledgeable and we need to lean in.
It's going to be a very useful tool for very many people. So thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Many thanks again to Kat for joining us and for sharing more about her book. I really enjoyed reading it, and it was such a pleasure talking to Kat.
Yes, thank you to Kat. As I said in the episode, Kat's book has really made me think about how I approach working with large groups of people in organisations and stay really watchful of the diversity of needs and levels of confidence in the rooms, and support everyone in being seen and heard in those conversations. As always, we really appreciate that you've listened all the way through to the end of the episode. Thank you very much. You can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen. It genuinely helps us to reach more people. So if you found this episode useful, please do share it with a friend or even a colleague.
Thank you so much for listening today. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another brand new episode of Starts at the Top, where we'll continue to explore what it means to lead differently.
See you then, and bye for now.
Bye for now.